system of mass production and distribution gives people the opportunity to own goods previously considered material and unnecessary. Products like vacuums, radios, refrigerators, and even cars can be seen in most homes, but mass production is not always beneficial. After World War I, Europe's economy was in shambles, and the U.S. began mass producing to provide for both Europe and itself. Once Europe started rebuilding itself, however, it no longer had a need for goods produced by the U.S. The large surplus caused prices to decrease dramatically. Producers were no longer making a profit. Despite this, people still spent their money or put it into stocks, over-speculating until stock prices increased to $87 billion by October 1929. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reached 381.17. Attempts by the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates and warn banks to tighten lending policies were ignored. It was a disaster waiting to happen. On October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed. In the midst of the panic, citizens rushed to their banks to get the money the banks owed them, but the banks simply didn't have that large amount of money available. Thousands went bankrupt all over the country and were forced to close.
The devastation during the Great Depression was seen pretty much everywhere. There were no jobs, there wasn't a lot of food, and people didn't really have a lot of hope either. Worst of all, they didn't have any money, which is sad.
After the stock market crash, prices continue to plummet. The GDP by today's standards goes from $103 billion in 1929 to $56.4 billion in 1933. By 1932, the DJIA has dropped to 41.22. During the Depression's worst years, 25% of the population is without a job. To put this in context, the highest annual unemployment rate after 1940 was 9.7% in 1982. In 2008, another period of great economic turmoil, national unemployment was at 7.2%. After the crash, the average suicide rate rises to 18.1 per 100,000. The Dust Bowl further cripples already struggling farmers. Those who don't take their own lives are starving to death.
This was like the worst economic downturn the country had seen in, well, ever. There was no buffer, there was no safety net, and everybody died.
Conditions were often blamed on President Herbert Hoover, whose laissez-faire way of governing didn't seem to be working. The country turns to a new leader in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
FDR was seen as a hero during the Great Depression. He came up with many new policies to try and improve the situation. The Emergency Banking Act, the Unemployment Relief Act, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agriculture Adjustment Act, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the NRA. Not to mention welfare programs which we still see today, such as Social Security.
The programs implemented by FDR were known as the New Deal. His personal favorite was the CCC, which gave work to young men planting trees, building parks and dams, and other forms of conservation. Social Security provided an income to those retired or too old to work. Perhaps one of the most influential acts signed by FDR was the Glass-Steagall Act, also known as the Banking Act of 1933. Created by Senator Carter Glass and Representative Henry B. Steagall, it was considered the first major banking act since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 and sought to improve the stability of banks.
Honestly, Steagall, this banking act is just about the best idea I've ever had.
It's Steagall.
Whatever, it was my idea anyways. I think that commercial banking and investment banking should be totally separate.
Okay, fair enough, but I think that deposits should be insured, at least up to $2,500.
In that case, we need to create a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
That's a good idea. We could make the FDIC.
Exactly. Good idea. Along with that, we also need to expand branch banking.
That's a good idea. And then the Federal Reserve should have more control over loans.
Indeed, indeed. Also, interest payments on checking accounts should be totally prohibited.
Right, we don't want any more competing banks.
Oh dear, dark days, never again. Lastly, officers from banks should not be allowed to receive loans from banks they work at.
Exactly, that's a conflict of interest.
Yes. I'm so glad we have the same ideas. It shall be called the Glass-Steagall Act.
It's Stiegel, but I still think it should be called the Banking Act of 1933.
FDR signed the act into law on June 16, 1933. It helped restore the people's faith in banks. Thanks to FDR's New Deal policies, the GDP began to rise once again, though it didn't reach its heights from 1929 until later in 1954. In current dollars, government expenditures and investments were at $8.7 billion in 1932 under Hoover versus $14.8 billion in 1939 under Roosevelt. Unemployment steadily decreased over time, but it was still at a high 17.2% in 1939. It wasn't until the U.S. entered World War II, however, that the economy really took off. Government spending in 1944 reached $105.3 billion, and by the end of the war, the GDP had risen to $223.1 billion. Full employment had also been restored. So it may have been the Second World War that truly saved America's economy, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal gave the people enough hope so that they could keep working towards a better future and not fall into communism like so many other countries did at the time. We Americans of today are characters in the living book of democracy, but we are also its author. It falls upon us now to say whether the chapters to come will tell a story of retreat or a story of continued advance.